All right, there we go. We are live. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice lunch. We are back for our third round of presenters today. Thank you, panelists, for taking in so much information. We'll have more time to process it and work with it throughout the rest of the weekend. In this presenter block, we are joined by Eric Danley, City Attorney with the City of Petaluma, Chief Ken Savano with the City of Petaluma Police Department, and again, Andrew Triple, the City of Petaluma's Planning Manager. So same format as always. Each of you will have 10 minutes in that order to give your presentation. You'll see our little timer on the screen held by Lynn. Just so panelists know as well, we're going to be a little more proactive about asking people to take pauses for our interpretation team in this round of presentations. And after you've all three concluded, then we will do about a half an hour of joint Q&A. So I'll pass it first to Eric. I'll get your slides pulled up.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be back with you again. I'm going to try to go quickly through about 10 slides and leave as much time as I can for questions. Alex, would you mind going to the next one? Thank you. So starting with some history about the Fairgrounds site, the city acquired that property for use as a public park in 1911 with $20,000 in proceeds from a voter-approved bond issuance. I'm going to try to pause a little bit for the translators. The initial features of the park included a campground, horse track, picnic area, and playground. The Sonoma Marin Fair relocated to the site from its former location at Fair Street, where the Petaluma High School now is, in about 1936. The 4th District Agricultural Association has leased the site for $1 a year since at least 1947. The existing lease expires December 31, 2023. Next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So the main theme for my remarks, and happy to go anywhere the panel needs to with questions, is that how the city acquired the site does not constrain future uses of the site. And that's true with respect to the bonds, that's true with respect to the current title, and also to the park uses, as I'll talk about a little bit further. Next slide, please, Alex. So concerning the bonds, the ballot question for the bond issuance in 1910 was, shall the city of Petaluma incur bonded indebtedness of $20,000 to pay the cost of acquiring certain lands for public purposes for a public park, commonly known as Kenilworth Park? That's the question put to the voters, and they answered in the affirmative by approving the measure. The indenture, which is the agreement between the bond issuer, the city, and the bond purchasers, was issued March 7. There were no restrictions regarding use of the land in the indenture, and the debt that was issued has been retired some time ago. I don't know exactly what date, but many years ago. Next slide, please. So there's a preliminary title report that's fairly recent concerning the property. It shows that the deed granting the city ownership does not include use restrictions. Those are sometimes called deed restrictions. The latest report, the preliminary title report, it covers various easements that have been granted to easement holders on the property, but there is no reference to any use restrictions regarding the property. Also, there are no other parties with ownership interests in the property listed in the preliminary title report other than the easement holders. Next slide, please. So there is a established body of law, both case law and statutory law, concerning that regulates cities converting parkland to other uses. So I'm going to talk about that briefly. The state laws regulating the abandonment of general law cities do not apply to Petaluma because it's a charter city. Also, because the city purchased the property with its own funds, rather than, as sometimes happens, rather than a property owner dedicating private land to a public agency like the city for public use as a park, usually via a deed restriction. That's not the case here, so there's no such restriction on the city's property. There are statutes that govern non-charter cities or general law cities conversion of parkland. Under the case law, they do not apply to the city of Petaluma because we're a charter city. If there are questions about that, I can explain it further. Next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So this slide illustrates what will be some of the automatic effects if the current lease with the 4th District Agricultural Association is permitted to expire. The association's property control would cease. The city's zoning and other regulations, land use regulations, permitting regulations would automatically apply once again to the property. The agreements that have been issued by the district to sublessees and other tenants would terminate. The district would cease to own the improvements as it does under the lease. However, the lease also provides that the district may remove the improvements up to 6 months after termination of the lease. Next slide, please. This is just sort of really about mechanics of decision-making in the city of Petaluma. The city council, as the city's legislative body, has ultimate authority regarding disposition of all city property. And there are some charter requirements that we have that apply to that, also that limit the terms of leases that the city can grant, and also address process of land acquisition and leasing. City advisory bodies, and by that I mean subordinate bodies that the council has created, like the planning commission and other commissions and committees, would play their normal advisory role to the city council in its capacity, making decisions about the fairgrounds, just like it makes decisions about disposition of other city property. Next slide, please. So some examples for you of the form that council oversight over the site would include or take. Regarding property management, that would include leasing and licensing, site and building maintenance, all operations on the site, risk management, meaning insurance, risk pool coverage, etc., safety. Building uses and approvals, as I mentioned, if the lease expires, all the city's police powers get reactivated on the property, which they're currently not in effect on the property because the association is a state entity, which is to say it's a separate sovereign and not subject to most of the city's regulatory authority. Excuse me. So general plan policies, zoning policies, development approval processes, code compliance, and use permits, those would all be under the city council's ultimate authority. And regarding events, this is a short list, obviously, but fair, rodeos, festivals, trade shows, and any and all public and private events on the site would be under that same authority of the council. Next slide, please. So, and this is also a very small list. It could be much larger, and really, in a way, this is precisely some of the things that that the city is looking to hear, and the council are looking to hear from the panel about, and also from the public. But some scenarios could include the city owning the land and leasing or licensing directly to program partners, including the district. The city could own the land and manage facilities and events directly, as with other city facilities, like the community center at Lucchese. The city could contract with management and or operations partners. Again, that could also include the district. And the city could enter into public-private partnership agreements. Usually those are financing arrangements, often done to provide public financing for, private financing for public facilities, major facilities like, for example, sports arenas or event centers, that kind of thing. That's possible. And the city could enter disposition and development type agreements. Those are agreements that were common when the redevelopment law was in effect. And cities, including Petaluma, use those to establish, to provide financing and to redevelop properties to higher and better uses or more desired uses for the community. An example in Petaluma is the Theater District project, is probably the city's most substantial redevelopment project during the time redevelopment law was in effect. Next slide, please. Was that it?
Apologies. No, that's not it. I'm sorry. Pause the time, Lynn.
Okay.
I just lost the screen share.
I know we're close. I think that is it, actually.
Okay. Sorry. Let me get it back up. I think the internet is just a little bit funny here. Just one second.
Unless someone gave me a secret slide I don't know about, I think that's the end of them. We might want to just go to questions. That's the last one I had.
Okay. Well, maybe that worked out perfectly then.
Yeah,
that is actually the end.
Yeah, I'll add one quick thing that was like almost like a footnote at the end of that slide, and that is those listed options there. As I said, it could be a much bigger list than that. That's just kind of representative of some examples. Those things are not mutually exclusive. So those different approaches could be happening simultaneously on the site. It's not just an either or kind of situation. Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And we'll hold questions until the Q&A. Thank you so much. Next, we have Chief Savano, and let me pull up your slides.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So this first slide just shows our mission statement, obviously working with our community to provide professional police services. Next slide. These are our values, and I'll just take a moment here to let you look at those while I just share some background for me as it relates to my comments today for this process. I've been a community member for over 50 years now. I just about turned 52 and started life on Caulfield Lane when it was 2 lanes. And I think the Fairgrounds were probably still considered on the outskirts of town at that point. But I've had 34 years of public service now, 28 as a police officer here in Petaluma, and the last 6 as your police chief. And thank you for that opportunity to do so. I'm honored. Before public service, as I mentioned, I grew up in town. I attended these fairgrounds and as a kid for many years with livestock. And as I learned the responsibilities of life and the rewards of hard work and teamwork, these grounds were as important to me then as they are now. I just want the panel to know that. But the size and location of the fairgrounds are a tremendous asset to a full service city with a lot of needs, much like what we heard this morning about the grounds themselves. My thoughts on the fairgrounds today and this important information gathering process comes from a place where I hope we can preserve the history and the heritage of this important community asset while also helping the city serve and our community thrive into the future. And my perspective is not as it was when I was a young child attending the fair, but as your police chief and thinking about the safety and quality of life for everyone in the community as we look ahead. Next slide, please. These are our 4 strategic priorities, and we're going to touch on not only safety, but community engagement on the next slide. Go ahead and next slide, please. And so for us, everyone's aware of the police community relations challenge that exists in this country. And while we've been really good at police work as a profession, communities with a strong level of trust and confidence in their police department, there's strong engagement and a strong relationship that's built. And one of the things about our facility now, and why I look to the Fairgrounds as an important site for future opportunities for community engagement, is that most modern police departments and facilities have community meeting rooms where we can welcome the community, into our organization and work on those relationships, as well as take our department and our members out to the communities we serve to build those relationships. So a vision that we have is that those we serve know those who serve them. And I think everyone can agree that that's never been more important in policing. And I see the Fairgrounds as a real option for creating community space for civic engagement at all levels of city government, not just policing. But clearly that's the focus in the realm that I'm currently working in. I think when I think back about the history of the city, in 1858, when we incorporated, the original city hall was where the A Street lot is now. And we shared the lower portion of that building with our partners in the fire service with their horses. And we were centrally located to downtown, and at the time centrally located in the community. So whether you rode a horse or you walked to City Hall or rode a bike or eventually a vehicle, we were accessible as city government to those we served. And it brought a lot of civic engagement. And clearly when we built City Hall where it sits now, still at the time, probably in the 50s, a little more centrally located. Ironic that we moved City Hall out, to the west side and the Fairgrounds to what was then the east side. But our police facility was actually built at City Hall. It's on the backside on Bassett Street. And we quickly outgrew that and moved to where we are now in our northwest location on Petaluma Boulevard. So, go to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk briefly about essential services. Just talked about community engagement and being accessible, not only as a police department, but as city government. And I want to emphasize to the panel that public safety is not just police and fire, right? Now more than ever, city departments work together to provide essential services to this great community. And, it took us 3 years in 1858 to incorporate. And back then, everyone wanted smooth roads, law and order, and good schools. And not much has really changed. And we're just trying to deliver those services in a way that are most efficient and effective for everyone in the community. But it's not just about policing. It's not just about fire and medical services. The fresh, clean water, our sewer system, our roadways, our intersections, how we get people around. It all matters when you talk about a safe community. And I think about I know the fire chief was with you earlier and spoke about their facility challenges. We have the same. They're much higher on the priority list right now. But we both commissioned a recent study with the Centers for Public Safety Management, and they've recognized that our facilities are in great need of either replacement or upgrade. And clearly, when it costs almost 20 times more to build separate facilities, they're recommending that we consider, looking at a joint facility because of the cost savings. I look at it as a civic center or public safety center with all of our essential services, how engaged our community would be once again, like it used to be when City Hall was on A Street, where everyone can get to us and you can get whatever you need taken care of, whether it's finding out about services or handling a police matter, paying your water bill, building a home or remodeling your home and getting the permits that you need if we were centrally located. And so obviously from my perspective, we would love to combine facilities, and fire needs to be centrally located. I think from a police response standpoint, our facilities should also be centrally located. We're not in the best spot where we are in the northwest corner of the city, But I think more than that, I think we should, and this is a unique opportunity to think about what this community deserves as a full service city, and to think about a civic center model where we all benefit, like we do for different events currently at the fairgrounds, but it really centralizes services and access for everyone. And so, from the essential services standpoint, that concludes my remarks. We'll go to the next slide. So emergency preparedness, and I know Chief Schock from the fire department spoke to you about this and mentioned the Emergency Operations Center for disasters and other events is located in our building. It's, it also doubles as our briefing room and our training room, and I think he got into some of those details. Never has it been more important to be prepared, and we've seen that over the last few years more significantly with fire. But really, the things that keep, the city manager and the fire chief and the police chief up at night, and I think Chris Godley spoke to you as well from Sonoma County Department of Emergency Management. The things that keep us up at night are the big ones, active shooters, earthquakes, a fire. We just did a tabletop exercise this week simulating a wildfire in Glen Ellen with offshore winds that came over Sonoma Mountain and into Petaluma. And so that's how we're trying to be prepared and ready for anything to keep this community safe, and to also be able to continue to help our neighboring jurisdictions when they're in need, like we've done recently. So I also see a huge opportunity for a state-of-the-art emergency operations center if we did look at a combined facility, and clearly with that needing to be centrally located, the fairgrounds is one of those locations that certainly I think should be considered as we look forward. Now, I'm not an urban planner, and I don't know if it can all fit in 50 something acres, but if I could have it the way I think it should be, everything would be there, and we'd still have a facility to enjoy and honor our agricultural heritage. So that's it for that slide. We'll go to the last slide just with my contact info. Always happy to answer any additional questions, and look forward to the questions that are going to come up. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And I am just going to double check that I have the correct presentation up for the city. Give me one moment. Sorry, everyone.
While you're doing that, Alex, could I just comment a couple of other things? One thing I left out of my comments when I talked about the other city departments is that a lot of our facilities, even public works, in my building, we have, almost $2 million worth of equipment for emergency preparation, but we don't have a safe place to store it. And so I know the fire department's in the same situation. The public works department is in the same situation. So there's a huge need for some more space. But anyway, I appreciate you taking those extra comments.
Thank you. Right. Just one more second.
And as Alex is doing that, if I can just jump in really fast. Folks who may have questions, jot them down so you have a second. As before, we'll try to go to folks who haven't had a chance, who haven't had a question so far today. So if you haven't asked a question today yet, be particularly thinking about a question that you might have. And if you have asked a question, think about a question as well, because we may come back to you. I'm just trying to get as many folks in as possible who might not have asked a question before. So yeah. Got wind coming in my window here. That's around. It's kind of fun.
All right. I think we're ready to go. Sorry about the delay there, everybody. Andrew Triple, I will hand it over to you. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, you so much for your time today, as well as for your service to the community. It's very important what you're doing here, and it's exciting to be a part of it. My name is Andrew Triple. I'm the new planning manager for the city of Petaluma. And however, I've been in the Bay Area in Sonoma County for 6 years. So as a member of the Sonoma County community, I'm familiar with especially the most recent years of discussions about the Fairgrounds area. So I'm excited to be here. With our presentation today, we wanted to provide an overview about how local planning looks to the future and seeks to respond to community needs and goals. It's through the planning process that we're able to define and establish the policy and regulatory frameworks that provide certainty and security about what can happen in the future. And then additionally, the process can encourage new partnerships to be created and encourages each partner, including the city, to leverage its own strengths and unique resources. Next slide, please. So as we see, the current uses of the Fairgrounds property are varied. Mike Parks presented many examples of special events and temporary activities that the Fair Board has supported. However, there's also a variety of long-term, well-established uses in place, including the Java Hut that was mentioned earlier. And so as we look at the current uses, we encourage everyone to consider how the current uses have evolved over time, and if they are meeting the current community needs. Leasees without site control, such as the charter school, may be unable to meet their current needs or the needs of the schools in the future. Next slide, please. We've talked about how the fair and other events bring people together to create memorable experiences, as well as how the fair supports emergency responses. We also want to recognize the Fairgrounds as a place in our community, the importance of its central location as Petaluma has grown and evolved around it. Chief discussed how important it is for his work to be centrally located. While the activities and services that both fire and police provide may not change, where they work from, the place where they're located, becomes an important factor for them and for our community as well. So we want to consider how the activities that take place at the Fairgrounds location can integrate with other surrounding uses, as well as to support the broader community. Next slide, please. And so we've heard a lot today about what has happened. Planning acknowledges and seeks to understand and learn from what has happened, but more importantly, it looks forward and asks what can happen. This also responds to Trish's question of why now? We do have the general plan update that we're working on. We are engaging both here with the Fairgrounds as well as more broadly through the general plan update in a community visioning process. And we're having active conversations about Petaluma's needs, both in the past and looking forward. And then finally, we also recognize and understand the importance of placemaking and how place can respond to the changing community priorities. And so we ask from the planning perspective, what are the current opportunities and what are the current priorities? Our general plan update, as well as this process, gives us an opportunity to articulate a broad community vision and the role of the fair area in that vision. We think forward in the planning process, and we are encouraged to think about the role of the Fairgrounds as a place in our community. Next slide, please. And so while planning is an open, exploratory process, it also has priorities that must be met. These include public safety. Chief noted that people still want to be safe, and that hasn't changed, but other needs in the community may change. And so we want to be able to acknowledge those, understand those, and plan for those other needs, as well as the circulation, both vehicular, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit that needs to happen. We want to think about the context in the neighborhood of where activities happen. And finally, we of course want to think about the environment, about the impacts of climate change, the impacts of vehicle travel on our air quality and so forth. Next slide, please. Here I wanted to share some key placement principles that are derived from the Projects for Public Spaces organization. First of all, the community is the expert. Nobody understands your community better than you. And so it's important, it's vitally important to be able to have a voice, to be able to share, and to be able to be part of a placemaking opportunity. And then next, we want to think about creating a place, not just designing a space, but really creating that place that is meaningful and enduring for the community. To do so, though, we have to look for partners. I think the days of a single entity leading an effort are gone. Here in the 21st century, as we look to the challenges that we face, we realize that the value of partnership and the synergies that can be created become vital to the success. And then it's important to have a vision, that vision that looks forward long-term, so that our short-term decisions can be made within some context. And then to think about how form supports the function, whether it's the form of a building or multiple buildings or a neighborhood, how they support the functions that we want to have take place. And then I think finally, a key principle that's emerging even more importantly, again, in the 21st century, is how we're responsive to change. We've all experienced this with COVID and the need to be flexible, to be resilient, and to be responsive. And that's just the same for a placemaking opportunity. Next slide, please. So here we take a brief look at what that means when we plan. We start with the general plan. We may use a master plan in some cases, not just for the fairgrounds, but for other places in our communities. And then we use the zoning code and the building code to implement those plans and to provide the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. Here's a bit of a deeper dive on each of those aspects. The general plan is an overarching 20-year blueprint. While the master plan allows for a greater specificity in unique areas and seeks to bridge the general plan vision and policies with a specific area. As I said, the zoning code and building code will implement and regulate the activities that take place. But finally, we also have to recognize the roles of our decision-making authorities, the advisory bodies to the council who offer their specific expertise, Planning Commission, HCPC, Pedestrian Bike and Bicycle Advisory Committee and such. But the City Council for the planning purposes is the ultimate decision maker. Next slide, please. And then the goal of this side is, in addition to having some color in today's PowerPoint, is also to help us think about all of those uses and how the general plan takes into account all uses throughout the community and looks at the relationship between them. As we see here, the fairgrounds has a multiple of uses identified, including the public, semi-public space, the mixed use area adjacent to Washington Street, as well as some park space. Next slide, please. And then the general plan also looks carefully at mobility, how people get around and how they're able to access certain spaces. With a location like the fairgrounds that's central in our community, mobility becomes very important and is an important factor in the decisions that we make. Next slide, please. And finally, a quick glimpse at the General Plan 2025, what it's done for the fairgrounds, the framework that it created back at that point in time. Next slide, please. And then how we look forward and how we want the panel to be able to share with us what the property can be. What are the needs that need to be addressed? What are some cool things that can happen here? And also, what are some things that have happened that could continue to happen or that aren't happening anywhere else in Petaluma, but would be great to have? So these are all questions that we think are important in the planning process and where we're at in today's conversation. And with that, I conclude my presentation and look forward to answering questions.
All right, thank you very much to our three speakers, and we'll open it up for Q&A until, let's see, for the next half an hour. So again, if you've written something down, please raise your virtual hand or your physical real life hand. And I see the questions coming in. Let's go first to Jackie.
Hello. I am wondering, and this is at both for Ken and Andrew. Sorry, I'm terrible with names. There are so many roads around there, right? I know that Andrew spoke to mobility, but as a response center, both for police and fire, given the traffic in the area, how practical is that? And where would the ideal location on the fairgrounds be for something like that?
Andrew, you want me to take first crack at that?
I think that would be great, Ken. Thank you.
Yes, great question, Jackie. Thank you. Well, I want you to know now that we navigate all of that traffic currently, responding from the northwest area of the city. We do try to stay deployed in our assigned areas so that our response time is shorter. But with respect to general practice, close to an arterial, especially with the freeway, that allows us to get to the north or south end much quicker, depending on where the call for service is originating. It would probably be better to be closer to the arterial, more towards the north side, the Washington Street side, because it's still then central, but also gives us access to a variety of options to get to the different parts of the city. But we navigate that very well now, and it wouldn't, in terms of positioning, that's the only real factor that we would have.
And I'll add on to that. When we work in, say that public safety does bring forward a specific idea, we can do some pretty sophisticated traffic and transportation modeling and really look at how some traffic flows would impact their needs. Both police and fire actively monitor response times, and they have criteria established for their response times. And so we would be able to factor that in as well. But that is part of the more fine-grained planning process that would happen after we would have some determination of how the land might be used.
Right, thank you. And I see we have a good mix of folks who have asked questions and haven't asked questions today, and I'm confident we'll get through everybody whose hand is up. So I'm just going to go through in order. Tina, you're next.
Yes, I am curious if anyone has considered that large parking lot that's just the north. It's part of the retail shopping center that's part of Target. And I'm wondering if anyone has considered using that. I know it's not the fairgrounds, but I wonder if that shopping center or use of any part of that land has come into the conversation at all in, I don't know, visioning out use for something that perhaps people have talked about using the fairgrounds for, and instead using that part of that land that's a huge parking lot that seems to just be unused. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tina, for your question. And that is a very good question as we think about how we utilize properties, not just at the fairgrounds, but elsewhere in the city. I'll ask both Chief and City Manager Peggy Flynn to respond. I'm not aware of any specific efforts to identify opportunities for that piece of property.
I would actually, Andrew, if I might jump in, the Q&A is actually just for presenters in this in this block.
Well, then the answer, Tina, is no, I don't have any information about how we might have looked at utilization of that property.
I could add.
If I could.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Eric. You're probably
Thanks, Ken. I just wanted to briefly mention, as private property, it's privately owned by the Regency Center owners. That's not something the city controls, and so it by agreement with private property owners, it's possible to make private property available for some quasi-public or partly public uses, but that will be a matter of reaching an agreement with the private property owners. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just was going to add that part of what we're doing as a city is looking at all of our public safety facilities and doing a thorough assessment. And so that process will look at available parcels that are within that central part of town, obviously. So it's not that it's off the table. It's just it's not something that's been looked at specifically yet.
All right. Thank you. And next we'll go to Deb.
Sorry,
And-
had a little trouble with my microphone. I did want to just clarify about what Tina just said. The parking lot she's referring to is where there used to be a Goodwill site, a little van or a little container. And I think that is Fairgrounds property because it's the same parking lot as before you even get to the Elroy's or the coffee place. So I just wanted to clarify about Tina's comment before my
Yeah.
question.
Deb, can you address your question to somebody in particular? Was
I'm
it
just
to-
anybody know that's what she's talking about because I do think it's Fairgrounds property. Anyone on the panel or people that presented, anyone?
Well, I'll go ahead and answer that. I was just going to say that if it's the private property area north of the shopping center itself proper, I believe that they're interested in developing housing there. The space that's between, let's say, the swim center and the open paved parking lot that I think you're referring to, Deb, I do believe that you're right. That is part of the Fairgrounds parcel.
So I was just asking, were you talking about the place where there used to be a Goodwill container?
Are you asking me, Deb?
Yes. Yes.
I'm not aware of a Goodwill container, but I've only been here in Petaluma 3.5 years. I'm referring to the parking area that is immediately between the between Washington Street and the 101 southbound on-ramp and the Target building. It's part of that retail.
Yeah, that is
shopping.
Fairgrounds. There's nothing there right now, but there's the Petaluma Airport Express is in that parking lot. That same parking.
No, not
Okay.
that. It's
And I'm
immediately north of Target, the actual Target building. And it's a large parking lot, an empty lot where you see a lot of, well, if anything, large trucks parked there, but it really goes unused.
okay. And I'm just gonna step in and ask, just since we only have our presenters for this limited window of time, maybe if we could move that to a small group.
Okay, sorry about that.
Debrief conversation. No, it's perfectly fine to ask for clarification. Thank you, Deb.
So
if you have a question for the presenters, feel free
yeah,
to go.
so my question was, how many acres is the speedway and is it blocking walk-through possibilities? Walk or bike through from one side to the other? If anybody knows.
I don't have the acreage for the speedway itself. I don't think we've done that level of analysis yet and have that information available. From appearances, based upon my review of the aerial data, it does look like it would block pedestrian through traffic. But then I think that portion of the fairgrounds is generally blocked for pedestrian through traffic outside of special events.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Deb. We'll go next to Eric G.
I was wondering if I've heard two terms thrown around, a civic center and an emergency operations center. I wonder if the fire chief or the police chief or anybody could tell me the difference between those two and if one of them had a significant larger or smaller footprint than the other. Thank you.
I'll take that. Thank you, Eric. So I think if you just thought about a public safety combined facility for police and fire, that facility would obviously include the design of an emergency operations center. And I think that footprint would be, smaller than a civic center model. The civic center model brings all of the city departments and services and community activity areas into one central location. So right now, the water field office is on North McDowell. City Hall and City Council and finance and a lot of departments are on the west side. Police is obviously on the northwest side. And so Public Works is down off of Hopper. We're all kind of fragmented currently. So a civic center would bring all of those departments and resources together where, police and fire would have adequate facilities for all of their staff and training. Public Works would have an area to be able to service the community with modern facilities. But it would be a holistic kind of civic center that wouldn't just be government offices. It would be about, community rooms and community spaces that are accessible to everyone in the community, not just when you need city services or have a question. That's a real rough difference between the two, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And just a reminder for panelists who've asked their questions, go ahead and lower your hand just so it's easy to keep track. Next, let's go to Rebecca.
I'm not sure who this should go to, if it's the city attorney or the planning department, but in the city literature, it's mentioned that the city's doing an environmental contamination report. So regarding that report that the city is conducting, what would the impact be if it were discovered that an area is contaminated or toxic? Are there any, what are your plans?
I think I'll start with that one, city staff. Thank you for your question, Rebecca. So the general answer to your question is that we would need to remediate. We'd need to work with the regulatory agencies that may have oversight over that contamination problem and come up with a remediation plan. And it would depend on the kind of contamination. Some kinds are threats to the water table and some are not, and they can be addressed different ways. But it will be necessary to address that so that it's not a hazard to the environment or the public. So some kinds of contamination can stay where they are in place and you can build on them safely, and others not. So it depends on what that report would reveal.
Right, thank you. Let's go next to Trisha.
Hi, my question is, if the city ends up putting some type of civic center on the Fairgrounds property, what will happen with the current city properties, fire department, the police department, city hall? What will happen with those properties? And also, why wasn't the Kenilworth property considered for some type of civic center before selling it off to the developer for the Target Center?
So I can answer that briefly. Maybe Andrew, you might want to add to it. But clearly, as we look at planning and looking forward, those properties would go through the same process that we're doing here, and like Andrew spoke about, to decide what would be best uses for the community. And housing clearly is probably one that rises to the top. But I also want to point out, and I'm sure Chief Schock from the fire department noted, that the location of the headquarters station is actually in a good location in terms of response times. It's just, woefully out of date and not up to earthquake standards. So in terms of the fire stations, there's not much that would change their locations because they've been sited properly. But if City Hall or the police station or other city facilities were going to be consolidated, then we would prioritize the needs of the community appropriately in a very similar process to what you're seeing right now.
I think, Chief, that was a great response. And Tricia, I would just add that, you know, some city services have the dispersed model with fire and police having stations located throughout the city to facilitate response times and to be more embedded in the community. While, you know, the planning services, for instance, typically just need one location. So I think that it wouldn't be a 100% consolidation of all services. You would still see some dispersion depending upon the particular department and their needs. So there's that aspect to a shift in where the city locates services. Typically, anytime the city owns property, it does have to go through a surplusing process should it decide that it doesn't want to any longer use that property. That process is guided by the Surplus Lands Act that was recently updated by the state. And so it would go through that process, and that's a public process if the city, again, determined that it no longer needed a particular location. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Do we know why the Kenilworth property, when it was sold, was not considered for anything like that besides developing?
Sure. I don't have that history, but I see that City Attorney Eric Danley has on mic, so perhaps he has some background.
That's even before my time, and I was appointed as the city's attorney in 2005. So I think none of us have that. We're closely involved. My understanding, though, is that that process was one of piecing together what became known as the Regency site for private development as that center primarily. But we could do some more research and fill that picture in for the panel. We'd be happy to provide that.
Thank you.
And if I could add to that, I think it's also important to note, that at the time, the city was not, in a position where it is today with Measure U funding to actually reinvest in city infrastructure. And so there was a different conversation at that time as well. So thank you.
Just a reminder to all panelists, quick clarifying questions, after your main question, fine. We'll just try to keep those follow-ups very brief so that we can get to more people. Thanks, Tricia. Let's go to Sandy next.
Good afternoon, Mike. Question is for Eric. Can you elaborate on what a charter city is?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Sandy. Thank you for your question. And I could actually go on for a long time, which I'm going to refrain from doing. The main features are that about half the states in the United States, the state constitutions recognize what's called the home rule power. And under that home rule power, charter agencies have the same full share of sovereignty that the state government has, but the charter agencies only have it with respect to what are called municipal affairs. For statewide concerns, charter agencies are subject to the state law, preemptive or controlling state law, just like non-charter agencies or like general law cities are. So in California and in Petaluma, because Petaluma has a charter and it's a charter city, the charter has reserved the full measure of the police power to the city that the state government has with respect to municipal affairs. One of those traditionally has been land use, although the state government has been encroaching a lot on that with housing laws, especially contracting, elections. There are a number of areas that are traditional municipal affairs. And with respect to those, charter city legislation preempts or controls over inconsistent state legislation. So we have in Petaluma, we have bidding rules that differ from state law and ours govern. Same with some of our election requirements. et cetera. So that's the main difference, I would say. It gives us more authority. The other thing I'll say is that charters are documents of limitation. They're not grants of authority. So by virtue of being a charter city, the city has that full share of the sovereignty that the state has, but with respect only to municipal affairs. The requirements in our charter are actually limits that the voters have imposed on the council. So special procedural requirements we have regarding some real estate, lease limits, some of those things are voter imposed limits on the council. And that's why charters are viewed as documents of limitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let's next go to Lena.
Actually, someone else answered my question, so thank you.
Okay. Perfect. All right, Celie.
Hi, thank you. My question is for the police chief, Mr. Ken. Thank you for joining us and spending time with us. It's been very valuable. The one question I have is ideally that you would be on site, either with a new large police safety center. But let's just say that didn't happen and that we went to some kind of park-like element that was completely open, a public space. Do you feel like you would have the resources to manage a large park in that space and keeping it accessible to everyone, all the citizens? And do you think that maybe there'd be an option for to create maybe a special community caretaker group, community members to help manage the space that was supported by the police? It's kind of two questions, but so resources and maybe a community partnership with the police if you weren't there, because ideally I think we're talking about you having a space there, but if you didn't, what would that look like?
Thank you, Celia. That's a great question. I think I'll just start by saying, there's a very old community policing principle that the police are the public and the public are the police, and that we as peace officers are just given the full-time duty to pay attention to that which we're all responsible for. So we can't keep this community safe without an active and engaged and involved community. So regardless of where we end up or what the space becomes or what the future of the Fairgrounds property is, we will adapt. And I have every confidence, as we've done, because we have a lot of open spaces and a lot of parks now that we patrol. And whether we need to be on a bicycle or a dual purpose motorcycle or an ATV or a boat, we'll find ways to ensure public safety. And whether they're volunteers or community members that act as, community guardians, just like we are, in a different capacity to be the eyes and ears and to help us keep watch over this important city, we welcome all of that. We can't do it alone, but we could adapt to whatever the property use becomes or whatever the future of the Fairgrounds property is, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And I see that Deb and Jackie have both asked questions so far in this round. So I'd love to go to Waka, and also we have about 6 or 7 minutes left for this Q&A. So just an encouragement, anyone who maybe has had a question on the back of their mind who hasn't asked one yet today, please, this is an opportunity to be brave and raise your hand. But let's first go to Waka.
I just want to ask a question. It's something that's been brought up multiple times over the course of the panel so far about noise issues related to what we do with the fairgrounds. And I was just wondering if there's any data on which areas tend to have the most noise complaints or the rate at which noise complaints are made, stuff like that.
I'll take that. Thank you very much. That's a great question, and certainly has been on the community's mind. I think that as the city has continued to change and develop and grow, and everything from trees getting larger to buildings being built that historically weren't there, and then, going through a 2-year pandemic where a lot of activity wasn't happening, we've certainly seen an uptick in reported calls for service about noise generation. We don't have a specific breakdown currently that I can share with you about which parts of town, but I can tell you that it's been mostly the southeast and the northeast side of town where some of those complaints have been coming from. But we are looking at doing that going into the future. And we've been working very proactively with the fair and the management at the fair to, to be good neighbors and to allow great community events to occur, but also be respectful of everyone's peace and quality of life in the community. So it's definitely on our minds, but we're working together with the fair to make sure that it doesn't impact the community in a negative way.
All right, thank you.
Right, great. And I see Jasmine's hand raised now. Am I correct, Jasmine? Have you asked a question in this round?
No, I haven't, not in this round, but I did in the first round.
All right, let's go to you first, and then we might still have time for Deb and Jackie. Go for it, Jasmine.
Okay, this question is for Ken, just elaborating on the previous question. So what does happen when someone calls the police with a noise complaint that's very clearly the fairgrounds? Like, I'm sure your staff knows, okay, that's a fairgrounds complaint because we're getting those. What happens? What's that process look like? And how does that get logged? And what do you guys actually do when you get that complaint?
Well, first and foremost, and thank you, Jasmine, great question. First and foremost, we have a computer system that tracks every single call for service. And so that's why we always encourage the community to report activity that, whether it's a noise disturbance or suspicious activity. So we do capture date and time and location of where the noise is being experienced. The current noise ordinance has certain decibel level readings that are acceptable levels, but even our ordinance is ready for some overhaul. But we're following that standard right now. And so what we've done, for example, is there's a level limit of 65 decibels, but there are times when you can take an ambient reading. In other words, we could go to the fairgrounds area right now, and just from the noise of the traffic and the freeway and what's happening normally without an event going on, the noise generated can be louder than that standard. So it does adjust a little bit, and I don't want to slow us down by getting into the weeds of the ordinance, but we try to evaluate it from that standpoint. And the current ordinance also requires that the measurement that we take be taken from where the person is experiencing the noise. And so what we find is when we get out of the area of where the noise is being generated, it falls below that threshold. And so we are actively and all the time calling and speaking with the fair so that they can speak to the organizer. And we try to work together so it minimizes impact on the community. But we're certainly following up as well with the complainants to try and let them know what we're doing to make it better.
Thank you.
All right. And let's go to Jackie next.
Hey, thank you so much. So this is a question mostly for Eric, as a city planner. We're in a drought right now. There's been a lot of talk about housing. What kind of infrastructure do we have to support what would presumably be sort of an additional pull on all of that infrastructure needed for safe housing?
I think that's actually a question for Andrew as our planning manager, but I'll be happy to assist Andrew as needed. Thank you.
Hi, Jackie. Thanks for your question. We are, the water department is required to do urban water planning to ensure that the water resources meet the needs of the community. And so they really take the lead on doing that sort of long range planning to ensure that the water resource is available. And then that resource is evaluated within the context of the anticipated growth of the community. So while they do that research to ensure that the needs of the community are met from a planning perspective, we do coordinate with them to ensure that the land use planning component is consistent with what their analysis is resulting, and that any additional housing development does have the water resources needed, as well as then we look at through various policies and ordinances that generate water efficiencies through the building code. So using more water efficient toilets at home, in residential structures, that's regulated by the building code, as well as low flow faucets and things like that. So it's really not any one department that takes the lead on that, but we collaborate together to make sure that we're working within the context of the analysis that's driven by water department, and then other policies and regulations that are being developed by other aspects of city services. Does that help?
It does.
Thanks, Andrew. And if I could add just one thing, Jackie, in response. One of the really neat things about Petaluma is our recycled water program that we have as a result of the Ellis Creek Water Recycling Facility that produces what's called tertiary recycled water, which is legal water. It's not just effluent anymore, and it's used for irrigation. And one of the main ways that we are able to expand, increase the net of Petaluma's available water supply for potable use is by directing recycled water to what were potable water uses. So a key ingredient of the city's future water supply is expanding the distribution of recycled water from the Ellis Creek facility to put uses that were relying on potable water onto recycled water that frees up the potable water supply that we get primarily from Sonoma Water as a water wholesaler, but we get somewhat from our own city wells that provide for some peak supply. So that's an important part of our future, and that's one of the things the water utility is focused on, and they're working on a master plan update right now about how to expand that distribution and therefore expand. It has the effect of actually, it's like new water when we make more recycled water available to free up more potable water. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you so much. I do have a
Thank
personal
you.
stake in that because I'm a private well owner, so it's a big deal for me.
All right, thank you. And we're going to squeeze in just one last question here. Deb, the floor is yours.
Hi. So I think, Andrew, you mentioned partnerships, and Eric, you mentioned the zoning is stricter if we don't have the 40 AA lease. So my question to both of you is, do you think that the city managers council is open to, say, like a 20-year lease with 40 AA, but maybe some conditions where there's other partnerships?
Well, I think, I guess I'll start, Andrew. I mean, I think we're open to whatever it is that the council ultimately directs once it hears from this panel and all the community members. All those things are options. The charter restricts, remember I mentioned those limitations in it. One of them is it limits leases to 50 years with one 25-year renewal. So that's baked in, but there's one of the main purposes of my slides and my remarks was to show how we're really pretty unconstrained. And our charter authority makes that even better. We can regulate in ways that general law cities cannot to provide for options. And so, and those things can be happening. There could be leases on that site along with city control, along with licenses. There's all kinds of possibilities. And I know the city manager and the rest of the staff are ready for the direction from the council, taking into account all the community input so that we can go into implementation mode and then make those exciting things happen there.
Right.
That was,
and I think we have to.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sure. Andrew, if you could make your comments very brief, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
I think that was a great answer from the city attorney. I would add that, you know, the partnerships can take various forms: public, private, public, nonprofit, and they can be structured in different ways and do different things. So absolutely, we're looking for the guidance from the panel on, you know, what it sees as the future and the success, so that we can take direction from that.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to this group of presenters for being here. Panelists, feel free to give your applause however you like. Thank you three for taking the time out of your day, and you're welcome. You're welcome to leave now. We just have a small group activity left, and then the panel will conclude for today. To panelists, as we shift gears here into the last 20 minutes of our time together today, just wanted to make a couple announcements in response to one question we've received from a couple of people is just more clarity around how you can email questions or get additional questions to presenters. So we wanted to be a little bit more clear about that process. So you have a couple different options. If you're someone who uses email and is comfortable with that, you're welcome to email, well, any of us at Healthy Democracy, but maybe the easiest address to use is just the info@healthydemocracy.org. And we can put that in the chat, and we'll make sure your question gets to the right place. And any questions answered via email, again, we'll print out and include in that document reference library that Lynn alluded to earlier. Another option is on July 2nd, when we're back in person, we'll have the same kind of wall where you could request documents. We'll have an opportunity to write down any other questions there and a process for getting you responses, you know, by the next session. So lots of different options, but wanted to make that a little more specific and concrete for folks who were wondering. I also just want to say a brief reminder that we do, at the end of the day, we'll still have the end of day survey. You're used to filling that out in paper form. Your researchers today will have a digital form for you to use. But before we hop into breakout rooms here, we just wanted to remind folks, please don't go right away. When the session ends, stick around. We'll be dropping a link in the chat, and greatly appreciate you filling out that survey as always. So with that, we're going to take a few moments with your moderators again in small groups to debrief. We've gotten a ton of information today. Let's have some discussion before we come back and wrap up the day. So Grace, do we have breakout rooms ready?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
I think we are set. I'm going to open all the rooms now.
Wonderful. Enjoy your small group conversations.
And just for folks watching the end of the live stream here, this is going to be the last thing of the day, as Alex mentioned. So we'll be cutting off the live stream for the day here. And please join us again tomorrow, Saturday at 9 a.m. We'll be doing 9 to 12 on Saturday and 9 to 12 on Sunday. And as usual, some of those will be public and some of that time will be in small groups.